Dogpatch USA once drew hundreds of thousands of families into the Arkansas Ozarks, a hillbilly theme park built on a comic strip so famous it got its own U.S. post office. It had rides, a working grist mill, a former governor running the place. Today, its rusted ride frames buried in weeds. It sat rotting for 27 years. And the thing that actually killed it wasn't the cartoon, it was a ski resort. To understand how a theme park in the middle of the Ozarks ends up dead because of snow, you have to go back to 1966 before any of this existed. A Harrison, Arkansas real estate broker named O.J. Snow was looking at a piece of land for sale. It belonged to a man named Albert Rainey Sr., who'd run a trout farm and a small show cave on the property since the 1940s. Snow had been chasing an idea for years, a pioneer-style amusement park somewhere in the hills, something built out of real Ozark culture instead of imported carnival rides. Standing on that land, looking at a 55-foot waterfall dropping into a canyon, he realized he wasn't just looking at farmland. He was looking at Dogpatch. If you're not familiar, Dogpatch was the fictional Appalachian town from Al Capp's comic strip Lil Abner, one of the biggest syndicated strips in American history, running at its peak in something close to 900 newspapers and read by tens of millions of people every week. Snow saw a real canyon that matched the fictional one almost exactly. He saw a cave that could become Dogpatch Cave, home to characters Lonesome Polecat and Hairless Joe, who brewed the fictional moonshine Kickapoo Joy Juice in the strip. And he saw an opportunity most people would have laughed off: build the cartoon town for real, in the actual Ozarks, and let tourists walk straight into it. Snow put together a group of about 9 local investors and formed a company called Recreation Enterprises. Then he did something bold. He sent Al Capp home movies of the land. Capp had turned down other theme park pitches before. This one was different because the setting was already sitting there, waiting. He didn't have to imagine Dogpatch. He could watch it on film. In January 1967, Capp signed on as a partner and reportedly told Snow the land was more authentic than anything he'd ever drawn, joking that he might have to change the comic strip to look more like the real place. Not everyone thought this was a good idea. State tourism officials were nervous the whole thing would just reinforce the hillbilly stereotype Arkansas had spent years trying to shake off. The same backward Ozark hick image the state had been fighting against in national advertising for decades. A couple of economists went on record predicting it would flop, the same way other regional theme parks copying Disneyland had flopped elsewhere in the country, warning that manufactured attractions like this one tended to drag down the value of everything around them instead of lifting it up. Nobody listened. In October 1967, ground was broken, and Capp showed up in person to watch it happen, posing for photos at the edge of the canyon that would soon carry his fictional town's name. What they built next was surprisingly authentic. Real 19th century log cabins were bought from around the region, taken apart log by log, and rebuilt on site. The cave became Dogpatch Caverns, and while bulldozing the site, crews actually stumbled onto a second untouched cave, which got preserved and named after another character from the strip. An old grist mill from the 1830s, the Peter Beller Mill, was restored until it actually worked again, grinding real corn for real visitors. This wasn't cheap plywood and paint. It was, in its own strange way, a genuine piece of Ozark history dressed up as a comic strip. Dogpatch USA opened on May 17, 1968. 8,000 people showed up on day one. There was a statue unveiling for Jubilation T. Cornpone, a fictional Confederate general from the strip, in front of a crowd of about 2,000. and Capp himself gave the dedication speech, calling it the greatest urban renewal project he'd ever seen. Admission was $1.50 for adults, 75 cents for kids. And just a few weeks later, something happened that tells you exactly how big this thing had gotten in the public imagination. The federal government officially renamed the local post office. It was no longer Marble Falls, Arkansas. It was Dogpatch, Arkansas. A fictional comic strip town now had its own zip code, its own mail, its own place on a map, something most theme parks never get close to. For a while it worked. The first year brought in around 300,000 visitors and roughly $100,000 in profit. That's a real number, and it's a solid one. You'll see other claims floating around that the park was pulling in close to 1 million visitors a year in the early 70s. Take that one with a grain of salt. Local reporting on that figure actually conflicts with itself, and the more reliable record says the park likely never cracked 200,000 a year after that opening season. Either way, it was popular enough to matter, and popular enough to attract attention fast. That attention came almost immediately. Within months of opening, the founding investors were already fighting over what to do with the profits. A familiar story in this kind of venture, where the people who take the risk on an idea start disagreeing the moment the idea actually pays off. A Little Rock businessman named Jess Odom bought his way into controlling interest for $750,000. Within a few years, he'd bought out almost everyone else, too. The park that started as a group project from 9 Harrison businessmen was now essentially one man's operation, which meant one man's decisions from here forward. Odom leaned into the spectacle. For the 1969 season, he brought in former Arkansas Governor Orval Faubus to run the place as general manager, which is the kind of detail that only makes sense in Arkansas. The park kept expanding year after year. A steam train ride, the first and only railroad in the county, mule rides and surrey rides, sea lions and an aviary, go-karts, a blacklight maze, a swinging bridge, costumed characters from the Strip, Daisy May, Mammy and Pappy Yoakum, Moonbeam McSwine, wandering the grounds and performing little skits for the crowd. Craft demonstrations, candle making, glass blowing, wood carving, with locally made goods for sale. There was trout fishing right on the property, and if you caught one, the restaurant would cook it for you on the spot. Local kids got their first summer jobs there. One former employee later remembered working there in the 70s as so much fun, the kind of summer job kids don't really get to have anymore. At peak season, the park employed as many as 250 people, most of them teenagers and young adults from towns nearby, which meant Dogpatch wasn't just a tourist stop, it was actually part of the local economy, one of the biggest employers in the whole county during the summer months. School buses pulled in every spring for field trips. There was a Miss Dogpatch pageant every year, with local girls dressed as Daisy May. Families dressed their kids up like the characters for photos at the entrance. One visitor, remembering it decades later, said her father fell for the actress playing Daisy May the moment they walked in. And that being inside that world as a kid just felt magical. For a stretch of the region, this wasn't just a business. It was part of growing up, a shared memory that an entire generation of Arkansans carried with them long after the rides stopped running, the kind of place people still bring up unprompted at family reunions decades later. But underneath all of that, there was a problem quietly built into the whole concept, and it had nothing to do with rides or attendance. Dogpatch USA's entire identity, its free national advertising, its built-in audience, all of it came from a comic strip Jess Odom didn't own and didn't control. Every newspaper that ran Lil Abner was doing free marketing for a park in rural Arkansas. and that marketing could vanish the moment Capp decided to stop drawing. On top of that, the park sat on a scenic two-lane highway in the middle of the Ozarks, nowhere near an interstate, dependent entirely on people willing to make a long, winding drive to get there. Outdoors, seasonal, and borrowing its whole identity from someone else's pen. That's not necessarily fatal on its own, but it's the kind of weakness that stays fine right up until the moment it isn't. That moment came in 1972. Odom decided Dogpatch needed a way to make money in the winter, when the park was closed and the parking lot sat empty for months. So he borrowed $2 million and built a ski resort right next door, called Marble Falls, Arkansas's first ski resort. It came with ski slopes, a toboggan run, an ice rink, a 62-unit inn, condos, chalets, even an antique auto museum. The marketing called it the Twin Parks of the Ozarks. On paper, it sounds smart. Diversify the business, keep the money flowing year-round, give tourists a reason to come back in January instead of just June. In practice, it fell apart almost immediately. Arkansas winters are mild. There wasn't reliable snow, and the resort had to lean on artificial snow machines running constantly for very little payoff. The first season's opening was delayed by a winter storm, which is almost funny, considering the whole resort existed because there usually wasn't enough weather to ski in. That sounded like a smart expansion. It wasn't. Then came 1973, and the oil embargo hit, interest rates spiked, and Odom borrowed another $1.5 million just to keep the ski resort standing. That debt didn't stay contained to the ski resort. It got cross-collateralized against Dogpatch itself, meaning the profitable half of the operation was now propping up the half that was bleeding money every single winter. In 1974, a partnership with a university theater group fell through, delivering only 2 of 5 promised productions. Small detail, but it was a preview of a pattern that was starting to define the place. Big plans announced with confidence, quiet failures to deliver behind the scenes. By 1976, the bank was already moving toward foreclosure on $3.5 million in debt. The park that had once looked like a guaranteed hit was now being financed on borrowed time. One loan stacked on top of the last. Then, 2077 delivered 2 blows at once. Capp retired the Lil Abner strip for good, and the free national advertising that had built this whole park in the first place simply stopped overnight. And the ski slopes, which had been losing up to $100,000 a year, finally closed. Here's the twist, though. That same year, with the strip gone and the ski resort dead, Dogpatch itself had one of its best seasons ever. The park could still draw a crowd on its own merits. It just couldn't outrun the debt it was carrying from a bet that never should have been made in the first place. By 1979, income had dropped below what it cost to operate. 2 separate injury lawsuits were filed against the park. Odom went to local towns asking for tourism bonds to help bail things out, and got turned down both times. There was even a plan to sell the park to a religious ministry group that wanted to turn it into a biblical theme park under the name God's Patch. That fell through too. In November of that year, Capp died, never seeing how the story ended. And in 1980, after a brutal heat wave and drought made it a second straight losing year, the bank finally moved in, seizing both properties. Dogpatch USA filed for bankruptcy. Bud Pelsor, a man who'd end up owning the ruins decades later, put it simply. There were a lot of mistakes, a lot of bad judgment calls made during a period when the whole country was going through serious economic upheaval. It's hard to argue with that. That sounded like the end. It wasn't, not yet. A new company, Ozarks Entertainment, took over from 1981 to 1986. And here's the part that complicates the whole tragedy. They actually made it work. They cut staff by more than half, brought in sponsorship deals with Coke, Dr. Pepper, and Tyson, booked real touring concerts, Reba McEntire, Ike and Tina Turner, and even hired an actor from the Dukes of Hazzard as a spokesman. Under this ownership, the park turned a profit every single year. For a while, it genuinely looked like Dogpatch had been saved, that the whole ski resort disaster had just been a bad chapter in an otherwise workable story. But ownership changed again in 1987, sold to a company called Telcor, and the slow bleed resumed almost immediately. Managers came and went through the late 80s as the numbers kept sliding, each new hire brought in with the same promise that a fresh set of eyes could turn things around where the last one couldn't. By 1991, the operation was facing collapse, and the new management made a decision that tells you everything about how far the park had drifted from what made it special in the first place. To avoid paying royalties to Al Capp's estate, they stripped the Lil Abner branding out entirely. No more Yokums, no more Dogpatch characters roaming the paths. They renamed it simply Dogpatch, Arkansas. The park had been built as a living comic strip come to life. Now it was erasing the comic strip just to survive a little longer. It didn't work. On October 14, 1993, Dogpatch USA closed for good. The property was auctioned off on the courthouse steps in Jasper. Most of the rides were sold off piece by piece. Some of the coasters actually got trucked all the way to a small park in Wisconsin, saved from the scrapyard by someone who didn't want them destroyed. But the big water slide, too heavy and awkward to move, was simply left standing where it was. And for the next 27 years, that's exactly what it did. It stood there, rusting. What followed was one of the more haunting abandonment stretches in American theme park history. Roofs caved in, ponds drained down to mud and algae, log flume boats sat capsized and half submerged where they'd been left. Roller coaster frames disappeared into overgrown trees, slowly swallowed by the same Ozark landscape the park had once tried to imitate. Windstorms tore pieces off buildings. Copper wiring and fixtures got stripped out by scrappers. Urban explorers found their way onto the property for years, documenting it, photographing it, turning it into one of the most recognizable ghost parks in the country. The kind of place that shows up on every list of eerie, abandoned attractions in America. One documentary filmmaker who grew up nearby described walking down into that valley as a kid, watching the world just transfer from reality into fantasy the moment you crossed into the park. Decades later, walking that same path meant watching fantasy collapse back into ruin. The crowds were gone. The silence wasn't. There were attempts to bring it back, and each one deserves a beat, because each one briefly made people believe the story wasn't over yet. In 2002, the property went up on eBay with $1 million minimum bid. A strange and slightly humiliating way for what used to be a nationally advertised theme park to try to find a buyer. Nobody bid. It went back up in 2004, asking $5 million. Nothing again. Nearly a decade passed with the land just sitting there, listed but unwanted, its rides slowly disappearing under vines while realtors quietly dropped the asking price. In 2014, an inventor named Bud Pelsor finally bought roughly 400 acres for nearly $2 million, with plans for an ecotourism revival, restoring the trout farm, bringing life back to the land piece by piece. In 2015, a fire tore through and destroyed 3 of the remaining buildings anyway. Pelsor later described the damage bluntly: windstorms that blew stuff away, arson that burned buildings down, floods that put water up inside what was still standing. In 2017, Pelsor leased part of the property to a group calling itself Heritage USA Ozarks, which took deposits from people, never paid rent, and simply disappeared by 2018 amid eviction lawsuits. If this story needed a villain, that's probably it. A former Harrison Chamber director summed up the pattern of these rescue attempts perfectly, saying people would show up for 2 or 3 months with paint and ladders and hammers, then just stop showing up the next day. Pelsor himself was hit with a foreclosure notice in late 2019 and left the state for good, one more owner defeated by the same land that had defeated everyone before him. Then, in early 2020, the property was headed toward yet another foreclosure auction. And days before the sale, a mystery buyer, operating through a Delaware-registered limited liability company, stepped in and bought the whole thing for just over $1 million. For a while, nobody knew who it was. Then court filings and local reporting revealed the buyer. It was Johnny Morris, founder of Bass Pro Shops. One local tourism official admitted his first reaction was disbelief, that he assumed it had to be a rumor until the sale was actually confirmed on paper. You'd think that meant a comeback. It didn't. Not the kind fans were hoping for. Morris's team demolished most of what was left, the same rusted, overgrown ruins that urban explorers had spent decades documenting, gone within months. Only the old highway sign was kept standing along Highway 7. The plan wasn't to rebuild a theme park. It was to turn the land into a private nature preserve called Marble Falls Nature Park, modeled on Morris's other project, Dogwood Canyon in Missouri, with hiking trails, a restored trout hatchery, and a restaurant eventually planned somewhere down the line. Government grant money followed, including federal and state funding for wastewater infrastructure to support the future project, with estimates tied to that grant projecting well over 100 new jobs and tens of millions of dollars in private investment. As of the most recent reporting available, though, the site is still a fenced-off construction zone. No opening date has been announced. No public access exists. A local realtor confirmed Morris has continued quietly buying up surrounding land, connecting the old park's footprint all the way down to the Buffalo River, over 1,000 acres in total. A Bass Pro representative told a local outlet there wasn't yet a formal plan for how to move the project forward. Even the construction itself has drawn some scrutiny, with state environmental regulators flagging water quality concerns tied to the earthwork on site. So the land didn't become housing. It didn't become a strip mall or a parking lot. It's being turned slowly and quietly back into nature on someone else's terms and someone else's timeline, with the public locked out for now, just like it was during the years of decay, only this time behind construction fencing instead of collapsing gates. Which brings the story full circle in a strange way. In 1966, O.J. Snow stood at that same waterfall and canyon and saw a fictional comic strip town waiting to be built out of real Ozark land. Now, decades later, a different Ozark businessman is looking at the same canyon and quietly erasing everything that was built there, letting the wilderness take it back. The manufactured version of Dogpatch is gone. What's left is just the land it was always trying to imitate in the first place.